All right, so here we are, another week in the Tim and Adam podcast. Here, we're discussing different biblical topics. So my name is Adam, and we got Tim on the line here. Just to give you guys a little bit of background, we're two guys who've been Christians for a long time. We've been following the Lord since we were young. We've both had paid ministry experience. Tim ran a church as a pastor for a long time. I've been to seminary. We've both not experts by any stretch of the imagination, but we've been around and we like talking about biblical stuff. And today we're going to be talking about miracles and the theology behind miracles and kind of deconstructing that aspect. And I think there's a lot here to talk about. So to start off, we should probably get some definitions here. So Tim, I'll ask you, what constitutes a miracle? So, I mean, a lot of people might be like, oh, the miracle of childbirth, or things that happen like in the matter of course of natural human events. But how do we distinguish between the natural and the supernatural? What to you constitutes a miracle?
That's a great question. I would say a miracle is something that would not be possible outside of some sort of divine intervention. So, it just in my understanding of things, if you'd expect it to happen ever, it's not a miracle.
Okay.
Basically. So, like, if it's raining and you walked outside and you're like, stop raining, and it stopped, I don't know that that's a miracle, because rain does always stop. If you have a broken leg and then that leg is all of a sudden not broken, I would say that's a miracle, because that's not something that would ever happen naturally, to like instantly have a bone that's no longer broken. That usually takes a little bit more time.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing. So I did find a definition. It says a miracle is defined by an extraordinary event ascribed to God that surpasses the power and order of created nature. And so I feel like this definition maybe lines up with what you said and what a lot of people might say, but I feel like it creates some problems here. So it's like God acting outside of his ordered created nature.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean, if we were to think about it as like a terrarium, so is theologically speaking or mechanically speaking, is a miracle like, all right, the earth is like a terrarium. God made it perfect. He made nature how it needs to function, and he sits outside of it. And then does he reach his hand in and intervene, like if something's not going well or he needs to change something? Like, does he tinker and then leave it be again? Or how is that mechanically, like, how does that work? That creates questions, I think.
Now, what would you say outside of a definition? What would you say?
As far as, like, what a miracle is?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I feel like, all right, I guess more interesting than, like, just an answer would be, like, another question, perhaps. So, in defining a miracle...
Less clear. Maybe more.
So, like, let's say somebody goes to the doctor and then it's like, all right, you have terminal cancer. You have a period of time before you're going to live. And then, this person prays and says, God, like, can you heal me? And then they go back to the doctor and the doctor says, that we've discovered there was an error, like the machine wasn't calibrated properly and you actually don't have cancer. So is that a miracle? Is that God healed her or changed the circumstance to fit her prayer? Or was it always that way, whether or not she would have prayed? I think these are questions worth exploring. Another question, kind of in the same vein, and this has been out there for a long time, but they say, can God create a rock so large that he is not able to lift it? So it's kind of like a double, like either he can't create the rock or he can't lift it. Which a lot of theologians like, this is a stupid question, I'm not even going to answer it. Mm-hmm. But then, I don't know, I feel like you miss out on some opportunity to explore some some theological questions there.
I don't know that you're missing out on much by answering or not answering that question. I'm going to say that is definitely a.
I mean, it's not like a real question. Its own. Yes, but
it's an interesting thought experiment, but it does nothing for you or the world or your understanding of God. It does make you feel smarter, I think, sometimes, if you can come up with a good answer to that.
Okay, all right.
But I don't know that, like, there's much... And I think that that's, like, maybe where, like, the definition of miracles can get a little sticky. Is, like, we use it to define something that, like, a real miracle, nobody has to ask a question around. Like, well, was this or wasn't this? It's like, yes. So
really,
Jesus, okay. I would say so. So Jesus walking on water, that's a miracle, unless there's something crazy. Like, unless there is like he's tricking you. If you're being genuine, I don't think that that's something you have to guess at. I think there's all kinds of things that happen that are incredible, but it doesn't have to be a miracle or not be a miracle. If it's real for you and if it's done something for you, then that's, like, I think served its purpose. But, like, getting into the definition of what is or is not a miracle, like the Catholic Church does that to say who is or is not a saint.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean anything for the person who's already lived. It doesn't change anything about what they did.
So for you, the miracle is about the application, the meaning behind it.
It's about the experience, I think, and the interaction. I think that there's a purpose in it. I mean, like, if God wanted to heal everybody, he would heal everybody. Like, that would be easy. But there's something else there that we're missing. And so, like, I think Jesus got asked a lot, like, do this miracle, or can you do this, or, like, there was a lot of testing, like, is this in, is this out? And he pretty much dismissed all of that, like, out of hand. Didn't engage with it, didn't seem interested in proving himself or not proving himself. Just like that was not a legitimate thing for him. But when he encountered need, he almost always engaged with that and, like, legitimate things. So I think coming from the academic mindset, he seems like he is disinterested at best with people's requests for miracles. And coming from, like, the human side of things, like a real authentic need or request or desire, he seems like he almost always engages with that. But yeah, I think it's mostly people after the fact who are maybe coming from, like, an intellectual superiority. Like, that seems like that's the people who are looking to define miracles. Or like the
this will be a short podcast if that's the path we go down.
Well, I think
I was thinking we could dive in into the theology of it.
Well, just so you know, I mean, we can, but Jesus doesn't care.
Okay.
I think is this how we can, and he does judge people who seem to care. I think that would be my say. So I mean, right, like, Tim. It's not like nobody's perfect. You can be, like, the loser in this situation. That's fine. Okay. But no, but so tell me your thoughts here. Those are just my thoughts. And I will judge you for anything you say after that. But
I mean, I think you are absolutely right. I mean, from Jesus' perspective, and a lot of the miracles that he does, Jesus specifically, is either in line with, like, teaching people about who he is, like, even, like, the bread and the fish, like, that has, you know, symbolism to do with, like, the Eucharist and, like, you know, sharing his body and communion and that kind of stuff. But then it also, like you said, in regards to compassion. But I think it is interesting to think about, like, the mechanics of miracles. Like I heard, so one thing I heard, and I don't know if this is true, but there was, like, a theologian that was writing about God acts within nature, but he doesn't act contrary to nature, but he might speed up the circumstances. So he's like, water into wine is a miracle, and it happened instantly, but it's like water is used in process of making wine. You know, he didn't do anything that was like outside of the natural course of things. Or like Jesus calmed a storm, and it's like storms dissipate. It dissipated like at Jesus' command, so that was the miracle of it. But it didn't do anything contrary to God's already created order. And I thought that was an interesting thought. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it.
I think,
like,
well, I guess you could say like raising the dead. That wouldn't be something that would necessarily.
And they did mention that. They said that raising the dead is something that would be part of the natural order because we are going to be resurrected at some point. But yeah, it does get a little kind of dicey.
I feel like that might be one of those situations where it's like trying to put a definition around something that like doesn't necessarily work. Like we can have logical explanations for like we have models that work around the universe, but we're kind of guessing, and it's kind of like we are at the point where I don't think that we realize how little we know. In 100 years, I think we'll know so much more. Humanity will have discovered more things, but like we're just figuring out like ways to solve problems that seemed like they worked, but we didn't have a reason for why. And I think usually through human experience, like we come up with pretty good explanations that turn out to be really, really, really wrong because they're based on bad logic. Like the earth is flat, or that the sun is the center of the solar system. Like all those things are like based around logical explanations, but they just don't necessarily have to be right or wrong, because like none of the explanations we work with have anything to do with what is. Like the earth is, the universe is, and I think that we don't necessarily understand all the rules. I think we do. And like the things like we have, you know, the laws of thermodynamics and like all these things that we feel like relate to all of creation, but they just relate to our small part of it. And we don't really know if they do or don't relate to anything else outside. Like there's so much more to the universe than we can see. And so like I think we get caught up in explanations or definitions, but I don't think there was anybody in Jesus's day, or as I'm like thinking through the Bible, who people argued whether miracles were from God or from the devil. People argued whether like Jesus was legitimate or whether he was not legitimate, but nobody argued over whether
the miracle happened or
that it was a miracle.
Do this, yeah.
No one was like, hey, well, you know,
it's not scientifically possible for somebody to be healed from this, so
yeah, like, or like there is a rational explanation. Or I think I've been a part of situations, or I think you have too, that like I don't think that's been the argument on my part, and I don't think it's mattered if there was something like an alternate explanation. It was like this thing entered in, and that's what's changing my life, I think, in this moment.
And I think...
Like go ahead. I think that like God doesn't need to interact with us through a miracle for it to be life-changing. But I think a lot of times a miracle isn't any more or less life-changing than like natural things. Like if there's things that like I don't know, I've seen or I've been a part of that like I don't know that I would believe if I had heard the story, but I was there, so like I think I do, and other people were there, and
do you want to give an example
a real thing
for the sake of the podcast here?
So like when I was a kid, I was in a church service, and it was like a weird thing they were doing. I was maybe 12 or 13, so like I wasn't necessarily like in it, but I'd like recently had an experience with God that wasn't miraculous or anything, but it was life-changing for me. And so I'm in this service, and I don't know, kind of like out of it. I think they said, it's like, put your hands up like you're going to receive something. And so like everyone did that. And then like my hands started to really, really tingle. Like they felt like they were asleep, but I wasn't doing anything where they would be asleep. And then the person who was running the service said like, they felt like God was saying that somebody out there was going to have their hands really tingly, and that they had been a part of the healing ministry, like praying for people or like healing sick people, and like people had been healed for a long time, and then they stopped, and like that whatever miraculous part of that had stopped, and that they should go up to the front of this service and pray for people, and that this was God's way of saying like he was reactivating this thing. So my hands are tingling. I don't match any other part of what this person's saying. I don't know this person. That sounds kind of crazy. But like my hands are really tingling, and I felt something inside me, and it was like, I don't know how to describe it, but it was like this like pull to go up front to wherever they said to go. But in my head I knew I didn't qualify for any of the other things. So I didn't do anything, and then they said the same kind of thing again, and I didn't do it again, but like I really felt like stronger, that like it was like a hook inside my chest, like just pulling me. And so I think I said to God, like, well, if this is like, you want me to do that, like have them say it a third time. Like, as I'm a kid, I don't understand this. I don't, like, they're saying all these things about a life events that don't apply to me. But they came up and said it a second time, or a third time, and then, so I was like, okay, so I went up to the front of this thing, and there was somebody I knew there, so I was like, hey, like, my hands are tingling, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, and they kind of, like, took me out into the corner. There was somebody over in the corner who was, like, wanted to be healed, and so they said, like, let's go pray for him. And I didn't know anything about it. Like, I think I had seen people, like, put their hands on people, so I did that. Like, I put my hand on his head or something like that. And they said, well, why don't we ask him what's going on first? So they said, hey, what's going on? The guy's like, my foot's broken. So, like, as far away as I could possibly be from the actual thing that was going on with this person. And, suddenly, like, I put my hands on the guy's foot and was trying to figure out what to say or do, and felt like I was doing it wrong. But then at some point, the person I had gone up to, like, said, hey, why don't we ask him what's going on with him? And the guy said, like, I've had this pain in my foot for like a year. As soon as like you put your hand on my foot, it went away. Like, you know, he didn't have insurance and couldn't get to the hospital, but I think he had thought it was broken. Like, he thought he broke a small bone in his foot. So, like, that happened. I did everything wrong. I didn't qualify for any of that stuff. And I think I ran into him a couple days later at the same thing. And he said, like, the pain was gone. Like, it had been constantly hurting, and it was gone. It hadn't come back. So, like, that, for me, kind of sums up my experience with miracles, where it's like nothing to do with me. I'm doing everything wrong. I don't really qualify or fit in for anything. None of like my education or my background or my status or position qualifies me for any of this stuff. And even like feeling like God's saying something, like getting that wrong half the time. But God does something anyway, and like he uses our hands or our words or just us being somewhere to do something, to interact and like inject a piece of him into like our reality. I think that is like, that's what's powerful. So like, regardless if somebody comes in and like, you know, fire falls from the sky if it doesn't like change us at all or doesn't interact with us as people, I don't think it matters. I don't think if it matters if it's a miracle or it isn't a miracle. It's not life-changing, or it doesn't interact with us.
When you were sharing that, I guess I'll just share one of my stories, because it kind of felt really similar the way you described it. How like you would think if you were going to have a miracle happen, like logically you're like, all right, I got to really focus. I got to really like try hard and really like put my heart into it, right? And then from like what you were saying, it sounded like you didn't really know what was going on, but God still used you. And I had kind of a similar experience. There was like they were having like an altar call, which sometimes churches do, and somehow I don't know how I got roped into this, but I got asked to like be one of the people who prays for the people who come up, and I did this actually with your brother-in-law here. We were doing it, and we were praying for this old lady who came up with a cane, and she had like an arched back, and she was like, I'm hurting, and I was wondering if you guys could pray for me. And like, I don't really do that stuff. I mean, I pray, but like, I'm not like healing man, and I don't think he was either. But the two of us like prayed for her, and then during the prayer, like she like stood up straight, and she was like, wow, it feels a lot better, thanks. And then she like carried her cane and like walked away, like holding her cane, like she didn't need it anymore. And it was definitely not something where I thought like, all right, I did this, because I definitely was not in that headspace.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know. I mean, it seemed like God moved, and I would call that a miracle if she experienced. I mean, I never talked to her after that, but it seemed like she experienced genuine relief.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's interesting.
And I feel like if you got into the mode of like trying to define whether that was a miracle or not, it would probably take away a little bit of what God did. And
why do you think that is? Because you mentioned the Catholic Church in this a little bit, and it's like they do have like it's interesting. I mean, it's different than like the Protestants, like non-Catholic Christians, but they have like a strict thing where they go through and they have to eliminate any natural possibilities. They bring in experts to evaluate the miracle, and a lot of times they employ experts who aren't Christian because they want like somebody with an anti-God bias to be like, this is impossible. And then they have a medical board where 2/3 of the board has to affirm that it's a miracle before they'll say, all right, this is a bona fide miracle, and put that stamp on it.
Yeah.
So you feel like this is not a positive thing?
I don't think it's helpful. It's like, what was, like, if you think about it from that person, and this would be like more from their perspective versus your perspective. Mm-hmm. So like, what was helpful for her in that? We're just gonna guess because we're not talking to her.
Sure.
But she was in pain, and then she's no longer in pain. And I think that like that would be a situation where it would be really easy to not qualify as a miracle, because like there's so much psychosomatic stuff that like our brain has so much control over our bodies, where like especially in regards to pain or like posture, there's so many things that can like a small shift in your thinking can really affect your body. Like it can. It doesn't mean it does, but at all the time, but it could. So you could say, well, that's not a miracle. But for that person, that was life-changing, in that she couldn't stand up, and then all of a sudden she could. And like, what would be the purpose of that interaction for her?
Yeah, just relief, I guess.
Relief. Maybe it's like she was thinking, hey, God, if you're real, have this thing happen. Or like take away a little bit of this pain. And she doesn't like that shapes the way I'm going to guess the rest of her day, and it's possible the rest of her life goes on a different trajectory because of that experience. But like that could qualify as like something shifting in her mind. And that doesn't mean that like God didn't do that. Like that might have been the thing God healed. But like for her, it doesn't matter if it's a miracle or not. Like she came in with pain and she left without it. And like that's important. I think that matters for us. But when we get into like evaluating, well, like, this isn't actually a miracle. Like, I mean, first of all, who are we to say that? Like, and why does it matter? Like, so many of the interactions Jesus had with people. Like, there's the prostitute who came and, like, washed Jesus' feet right before he was crucified. And, like, he interacted with her, and there was no miracle there. Like, she was washing his feet. His disciples were like, get her out of here. And he said, no, like, she's doing something. She's, like, preparing my body for burial. And, like, she's doing something that's so important in this situation. I'm not going to take that away from her. And she, like, says, your sins are forgiven. Which, like, in the day was not, like, a normal thing to say to somebody. And the idea was, like, only God could say that. But he didn't do any miracles. But he did do something for her that was so special. And, like, it didn't matter if it was a miracle or not. Like, he came up to people and said, like, follow me. There's no miracle there. But it was just as life-changing, if not more so, than a lot of the miracles he did.
And I agree with that sentiment. Like, you know, a lot of times, like, when we talk about spiritual gifts, like, prophecy is one that comes in where it's like, oh, this is an important one because, you know, if you can, like, tell somebody the future, like, speak into their life, some word, some, like, knowledge that you couldn't possibly know, like, that's a huge deal. But it's like, really, at the end of the day, it's like those are just kind of the more flashy examples of how God interacts with us. But it's right what you're saying. It's like, it really is about the heart change. And I think there can be sometimes a tendency to have too much emphasis on miracles. Or like, if I only saw this miracle, then I would believe. But it's like, it doesn't really work that way.
And, like, I've been a part of things that I would consider miracles. I don't know that any of them were life-changing. But, like, there's weird things of, like interacting with God's presence, like that situation, or, like, understanding something different, like, that has changed my life. And I don't know that, like miracles, I think, are so important. And, like, they do something, but it's really easy to argue whether something is real or not, or whether it didn't happen, or whether, like, it was just your perspective. And none of that really matters. Because, like, it's done. It's gone. It's in the past. But, like, if God's real, who he is, like, going to continue on past that one experience.
And miracles definitely, like, pale in comparison to the glory of God. So, like, one thing I would say, so there's a female pastor that you and I both know who, like, she spoke once in a sermon about how her mom was, like, really sick and on her deathbed, and then she passed away. And she explained how she, like, prayed for her mom to come back to life. And she was like, I genuinely, like, believed that God would do this with everything in me. And then she didn't come back to life. She's like, it was not due to my lack of faith because I believed it. But then afterwards, it was, like, really hard because the thing that I believed would happen didn't happen. And, like, that's a hard thing to rectify. But then there's also the thought, like, what if her mom had come back to life? You know, this woman now is, like, in her late 70s. I mean, her mom would be dead anyway, even if she did come back to life. You know what I'm saying? And it's like Jesus brought Lazarus back to life. But Lazarus ain't walking around Walmart right now. Like, he's dead.
He chops the target.
Yeah. But, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that was, like, it's as incredible as those miracles would be or were. They are nothing. They fade away in this present age and this life that is headed towards death and decay.
Yeah.
They're just like a little fleeting glimmer of God.
Yeah. And I think, like talking about the prophetic also in that, like, I think there's something miraculous in that, but it's not as flashy as, like, somebody who's blind being able to see all of a sudden. But, like, I don't know, there's something, at least for me, that's more real about that, where it's, like, a bit of God interacting with my life with, like, a message versus a thing that happens that's, like, powerful, but it's, like, it happened and it's done. And it is really interesting. I feel like the miracle side of things, like do you know anything about like Mesmer? Um, so that Benjamin Franklin is in this like story of he was living in France. I think he was maybe one of the diplomats from like the early United States to France. So King Louis XIV, I think, is dealing with this problem where there's all these aristocrats who are following around this guy named Mesmer, who was healing people. Like there was like a girl he was tutoring who was blind, and like she started seeing, and like it was about like 50% of these people would have things get better or all the way better, like being blind or not being able to walk. Like he was doing miracles, and so he relied his like spiritual theology around that was animal magnetism is like where that word comes from. But he like there's these things that like had this animal magnetism, like these objects, and they kind of with his power healed people. So the king of France sends Benjamin Franklin and some other people to go investigate this thing, and this is where the I don't know why when you take medicine and you get better, but you don't know why, or it's just like the random thing, the
Placebo.
Jeez, yes. So the placebo effect. That's like where that idea comes from.
Okay.
Like that's how they describe these miracles. Like sometimes this just happens because we believe it's going to happen. Like this power of faith, but the placebo effect, being mesmerized, and the animal magnetism, like there are these words that we kind of are somewhat familiar with, but they come out of this time of this person who's doing miracles. No one understands why. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And Benjamin Franklin is on this panel of people who are trying to describe what's going on. So I think that there is that aspect to miracles where like people have miraculous experiences and we don't have a good explanation for it. And so we say, I think a lot of times we ascribe spiritual meaning to things we don't understand scientifically.
Sure.
And I think
even today we still.
Yeah, well, definitely. And there is the placebo effect. Like we don't know why people.
Yeah, the human brain is very powerful. Can heal.
Yeah.
A lot of things.
People take a sugar pill and they get better.
Yeah.
Like why? They had a real problem and it's better now. So like that can factor in, but I think when there's like the prophetic involved and like you hear a message like from somebody who doesn't know you and who understands like aspects of your life that they should not know, that's a big deal.
Sure.
Tell Sam I said hi. But like it's just a strange thing, and like that for me is more powerful than like somebody who's sick, like you pray for them and then all of a sudden they're better, or even like a broken bone.
Sure. Because
like I think we have a reference for how the mind can work with that. I don't think we have a reference for how like you can know something that you don't know, or details about somebody that like are both like healing and like you have no business understanding. I think that's, at least for me, where I've experienced God more than like the miracle side of things.
So changing gears just maybe a little bit. I did want to talk a little bit about like the idea of divine intervention and this idea of God intervening in his creation versus the natural versus the supernatural. And I do kind of feel like I kind of pose the question with kind of having a little thought of an answer in mind, but back in like Jesus's time, there wasn't like nowadays we kind of have this kind of distinction, like these two silos where it's like, all right, we've got science on one side, religion on the other. You know, we have like the natural world, and then the supernatural world is like this realm that sits like on top of the natural world, and occasionally they'll interact with each other. But I think that's not how like the ancient people understood God to operate. And I think the scriptures kind of align with this, where it's like God is creation. God is not apart from creation and then intervening in creation. God is the force that keeps creation together. God is in everything and is everything. And something that I find interesting, and I don't know that it's necessarily direct connection, but I like talking about it because it's interesting, is like quantum dynamics a little bit. Like when you get to like the really small particles in the makeup of our universe, you have like, I don't know if you're familiar with like the fine structure constant.
I think so. Is that like the string theory, or is that
kind of? So the fine structure content is a mystery in quantum mechanics. And the mystery is that there's this force that is found throughout the subatomic world. Like it's the force that holds atoms together. It's like the distance between atomic particles. It's like the electromagnetic force. And it all is 1 over 137. This is like the number. That's the fine structure constant. And if it was a little bit different, like if it was 1 over 138 or 136, like the universe would not be able to exist. Matter would not like cohese. It would not be cohesive, and atoms would just fly apart. But it's like everything and all different over many different things like revolve around this one constant. And it's like they don't know why that number. It's like it's kind of, I've heard it described as like evidence for God. Like this force is the thing that's holding everything together. If it was a little bit stronger or weaker, nothing would function, but it's like the exact thing it needs to be for our universe to exist, and nobody can explain it, and nobody knows why yet. And it might be totally unrelated. Like you said, there's lots of things that happen in the world that we don't know, and we attribute it to God, and then we find out later that it's like, oh, the sun isn't the center of the universe, and it changes our perspective. So this might be one of those things but I think it's interesting that there is like a force that is in everything, and God is described as omnipresent. So
yeah, and I think that we can, like you're saying, like attribute things to God, like this is supernatural or this is evidence of God that like we just don't know enough about yet. And so I think there is like wonder, like the human eyeball is like one of those things. I think like a lot of creationists will like use like the complexity of the human eyeball is so crazy that like it wouldn't be able to come up through evolution, which like I don't think is true. It is really crazy, but that doesn't mean one thing or the other. I think a lot of times there's this Nobel award-winning scientist who he wrote this book called Fast Brain, Slow Brain. Have you? It's a fascinating book. I read a couple years ago. So this is like off the cuff. I'm probably getting a couple things wrong, but they talked about some of the characteristics of the human brain and how really amazing it is, and how I think it's like, I think I heard this in the last year, for like the world's largest supercomputing system to do what the human brain does in a second, it would take like 45 minutes right now. And obviously that's changing, but it's like still 1 second of background processing for the brain is just an astronomical amount of information being processed. But he talked about one of the flaws in the human brain is not being able to know when you don't know. So we always assume we have access to just about all the information that is out there, and we don't. Like we only have information for what we have now. So that's why like people could say Galileo must be, a pagan. He's doing something against God by saying that the earth revolves around the sun instead of everything revolving around the earth, because humans are the center of creation. And like they form everything around what they know and not around what is. Because now we know a lot more. And like we've, with, you know, the infrared telescopes out there now, like we can see into the universe in a way that we haven't been able to do before. But like the Webb telescope. But that's just the last year. Like, we're starting to understand things that we didn't know. And we're going to continue to do that. But, like, I think about it, like, if you had a goldfish and it was trying to define you as a person, like, and just what, like, even if your brain was in that goldfish bowl and only what you saw was your reality, you would say, okay, he walks on 2 legs. Sometimes he sits, sometimes he stands, but he's always on 2 legs. And then, like, a baby comes along, and, like, well, there's 2 of them, but, like, we don't have a box for the small one. And they're not on 2 legs, so they're not God. Or they're not you. Or they're not human. And like, they wouldn't have a framework for, like, driving in a car, because it's outside of their realm. It's outside the walls of the house. Like, you don't ever drive your car inside the walls of those houses. But it doesn't know anything else. I think that that's, like, part of our issue, is we're always trying to define everything with what we have, and assuming we can get there with what we have. I don't think that we can define things with our current understanding. And so we come up with those things. We come up with rules and regulations, and, like, this is a miracle, this isn't a miracle. This is our way of doing it. But, like, we don't have the humility to say, if there is a God, it's something so much bigger than what we can understand that, like, we wouldn't be able to understand it. And, like, that's a very obvious statement, but not one we take just about ever. You know what I mean?
Well, it kind of goes against our natural wiring, like you were just saying.
And, like, that's it's like so obvious. We say, like, well, this has to be God, or this can't be God, or this could be explained other ways, therefore we can't say it's God. But, like, if there is a being that was able to, like, create the universe as we can, like, now observe it from, like, the grandest, hugest nebula to, like, the finest minute particles, like, that's a being that's so incredibly complex and powerful, and, like, we wouldn't be able to even scratch the surface.
But if that universe was a rock, could God lift it?
And so, and, like, but, like, we're thinking again, like, even in that like, kind of, you know, silly example, it's like we're thinking about things here and now, and, like, it's one of those questions, like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, where it's like there's no right answer, but it's something that you can, like, prove whether or not you can think right by answering that question. And I feel like that's the opposite of what we should be doing, which is, like, just being in awe of what's around us. Whether I think you believe in God or not, like, the structures, how big and how small they are just amazing. And, like, we get caught up with so many things that really don't matter. Like how much money we have, or, like, whether we're going to live to be 100 or not. Like, those things don't matter. Like, it's an amazing, awe-inspiring reality that we live in.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something that's, like, amazing.
I mean,
in that.
Life is a miracle, so it is.
Dude, you're a miracle.
But I just wanted to kind of touch on something you mentioned. So, like the eye being, like, evidence of God, because of its complexity, and I feel like more so. I mean, that idea I think maybe is a little bit flawed, but more so than that is consciousness and, like, our understanding of self. Because if you think about that, like, how energy intensive our brains are, and, like, what it takes to create language and consciousness, like this, like, if you think about how evolution evolves, like, we evolved to stand up because you get a better, like, line of sight. You know, we evolved to the color cones in our eyes because you can distinguish like red apple against a green background of a tree. You know what I'm saying? Like you can there's rational, natural explanations for why we evolved the way we did, but there is no real explanation for consciousness. Like you don't need to have our level of thought and language to say like there's a tiger, run, or ah. You know what I'm saying? Like beyond like a normal animal like making noises. Like
well, so the interesting thing for me about like COVID was like you get to see in real life or real time like evolution of like the virus, which is like, I mean, I'm guessing it's a similar thing within species, but like it's coding errors. Like there's millions and millions of coding errors that happen over time, and most of those get wiped out. But every now and then there's this coding error that works just perfectly to like create an advantage, and that thing replicates more.
But what advantage does speaking or forming civilization give us?
Well, so like that's how complex this is. It's like we've taken that, like, you know, the evolution of species, like Darwin kind of sees, okay, these animals don't exist anywhere else, but this is an isolated thing, like the Galapagos Islands are an isolated place, so they have like evolved in isolation, and they're different than what we've seen anywhere else, because like they have been able to have those coding errors, like, and genetics passed down that are just a little different. So like that's interesting, but it doesn't explain how you go from plankton to a chimpanzee. Like that's too big of a jump for our brains to at least to come. Like we have to make big assumptions out of that. And I think that like creationist people make so many bad assumptions, and I think evolution has so many bad assumptions where it's just taking what we see to the nth degree and saying that explains everything. Because like we just don't know. We don't have good evidence. Like how does a planet full of dinosaurs go through so many mass extinctions and produce what we have now? Like these are different things. And like the coding errors don't quite explain that. Like the evolution of gills versus no gills. I like, for at least for me, I'm thinking like there's probably some big things we're missing in all aspects of our understanding of reality. And like I'd be curious on like I can see how you get from like a megalodon to a great white shark. Like there's some size differences. I can see that like characteristics over a couple million years would change things. But I don't know how you get from like a shark to us from like the same miscoding of things. And I think that like whether it's creation or something else, I think it's something different than what we understand. And I think it's okay, like that's frustrating to say like, well, we just don't have the answer. And all the arguments are flawed.
Were there dinosaurs on the Ark, Tim?
I don't think so, because I'm pretty sure the Ark was 10,000 years ago. And
I saw this video of this creationist trying to explain how God got dinosaurs, or Noah got dinosaurs on the Ark.
So frustrating to me.
So like, where did Noah store bees on the Ark? In the archives.
Dude, one of my I guess it's my second niece came up with this one. What's the spaghetti's favorite dance?
What's that?
It's the meatball.
Oh, it's
that was like a I think like an 8-year-old came up with that.
The meatball, yeah.
That's basically where I take your Ark joke. It's just like I know so many really intelligent people who are creationists and like short Earth creationists, and like you are constantly going through these mental gymnastics to like explain something that is not reasonable. And like I think so many scientists who like are trying to explain evolution, and it's not explainable. And like the bounds of science are observation. Like you don't get to call something science if you can't observe it. And everything that's happened in the past on some level has limited observation. Like we can tell certain things about it, we can carbon date, we can like look at all these different things, but like forensics that go through a crime that happened just yesterday are not conclusive. Like there's so many things you can't figure out that just happened. It's like we just don't know. And like I don't think we can know. We can wonder and we can explore, and we'll probably know more every year from here on until there's some sort of apocalypse.
All right. So in final kind of question here to wrap up miracles.
You can see why I've been diagnosed with ADHD. Because it's all interesting. And I lose track.
I agree, and I like it. But this is a question that I have that is probably in the unknowable category that you're talking about. But so I think about like the butterfly effect. Like you're familiar with this. Like if a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa.
I've seen the Ashton Kutcher movie, but that's
okay. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen that. It's like I don't know. But they say if a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa, it could cause like a hurricane in the Bahamas, right? Because it's like you displace something, and it has an effect. So it's like, all right. So Jesus is on the boat. Jesus calms the storm, right? So they don't know anything about how weather works back then, and it's like God calmed the storm, and that's the extent of it. But it's like we know that weather moves from high pressure systems to low pressure systems, and it's like constantly moving, and what happens in one area affects another area. So if you have a raging storm going on that is suddenly calmed, like is that something that has wide reaching effects throughout the region and history even?
Just about every storm has an edge. And so I feel like those kinds of things are a little bit difficult.
You think it's contained?
Like, well, I mean, it's so much bigger than our current understanding. Like, we look at today, from all the things that you're describing, like, we understand all that stuff. But, like, the variables in a system are so enormous. Like, you see those spaghetti models for the hurricane tractors. Mm-hmm. There's, like, 100 different models that are so sophisticated, and they all disagree. Like, there's just too many different variables. So it's something for me that was so helpful in thinking about those kinds of things was I'm in the construction industry. So when I first learned how to bid jobs, what they say was like, do all your math, figure out what your labor costs, all your material costs are, figure everything out that you can possibly figure out, write it all down, total it up, triple it, and add 20%. Because you will miss the majority of the things that need to happen or that will happen. Like, you don't know, and if you triple it, or if you've got a lot of experience, if you double it, you'll come close. But, like, just know that you don't know and prepare for that. So I feel like so many things with miracles, or what you're saying, they're thought experiments that are interesting, but dangerous, and that it gives us I think there's like a subtle message that we can understand these things.
You really don't like the thought experiments. See, I'm all about the thought experiments.
I think that they're fascinating, but I think that they do distract and like stop us from really understanding the bigger things. So that like the people that Jesus was so upset with all the time were the people who were constantly engaging in those kinds of things. And I think that the people who my life has been destroyed by the most are people who have put set definitions on things that they didn't understand. They've said, like, this is the way it is. These are the rules. This is how life is. This is how God is. And they were wrong. They just thought they were right. Because they had, like, some simple ways of thinking to understand a really complex structure. I think that, like, we can get in trouble by trying to assume that we know instead of being curious.
All right. You win this round, Tim.
No, well, I'm not saying the thought experiment is bad. I think the thought experiment for the sake of itself is bad. And I think, like, thinking that we've understood it is bad.
Okay.
And like, I think if I was really going to sum it down, like you and your way of thinking is bad. Mostly that's what it is.
Okay. All right.
But that's where I would end my statement.
All right.
No.
Well, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just
You're
gonna
trying
say.
to wrap me up here.
Well, whatever.
No, it's time.
It's time. All right. Well, if you guys, I don't know how many of you are still around listening to this at the moment, but if you are, God bless you.
So I would say something's wrong with you. And maybe you need an extra blessing in there. But
but get make yourself a sandwich and get some sleep tonight. That's what I say.
I would say
still watching.
The most interesting thing would be to ask God to interact with you in your present situation. I think that's like way more valuable than having those definitions of miracles, is like experiencing miracle or everyday experience, but something of the divine.
Great. All right. Thanks, Tim.
Well,